she's facing potentially driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, hit and run, and potentially some type of reckless endangerment for the reckless driving that occurred right before the crash. Keep in mind that each of these charges are misdemeanor charges. There is a potential for up to 6 months in jail, fines, as well as having her license suspended for quite a lengthy period of time. Assuming that the toxicology reports would come back in her favor, I still think she's facing at least a hit and run charge and a reckless charge. And the reason is, whether she was using alcohol or drugs, she still acted recklessly. She was driving at a very high rate of speed. We know that she hit at least one structure, and instead of staying behind, contacting the police and giving her identification, she drove off and hit another structure. So I think that's going to be very tough for her and her attorneys to defend. The police obtained a search warrant to get blood from Anne Heche, and the prosecutors obviously are hoping that it's within 3 hours, because that's when the results would be the most reliable. There's going to be a test done on the blood to determine whether there was alcohol in her system, and if so, how much alcohol was in her system. And the second question is, were there drugs in her system? If there were, they're going to do follow-up tests to determine what type of drug was in her system, and again, how much of that drug was in her system. Once they determine there's drugs in an individual system, the next test is to determine how much of those drugs were in her system. You can have alcohol in your system. You can have had arguably a drink and still be allowed to drive. The issue is whether or not, when it comes to alcohol, it's over the legal limit. Drugs is a little different because, in a sense, it really doesn't matter how much of the drug you have. If it's an illegal drug, or if it's a drug you're not allowed to use when you're driving, whether it's a little or a lot, you can still be charged. Either way, I believe Anne Heche is going to be charged with something. Now, we have to wait for the toxicology reports to come back to determine whether or not there's going to be enough to charge her with driving while under the influence. The first thing law enforcement has to determine is whether or not there was alcohol in her system. If there was the amount of alcohol above the legal limit? The second question is whether or not there's drugs in her system. And if there were, what type of drugs? Are these drugs that would inhibit in any way her ability to drive? These are the questions that they're going to want to ask before they decide the exact charges.
Vehicle into a structure. We also have a structure fire, two-story, single-family dwelling, heavy smoke showing.
So there is a victim in this case. That's the woman whose house was damaged and set on fire. And there's several things that can happen. First, during the criminal proceeding, there can be restitution during that sentencing phase if, in fact, she's found guilty. The second thing is she can file a civil suit against Anne Heche for the damage that she caused to her property.
They're going to remove the body from the burning vehicle and possibly transport the victim to a hospital.
We all hope that Anne Heche gets better. We know right now she's in the hospital, and so I don't think there's anyone out there that wants anything but the best for her. At the same time, if in fact she has alcohol and drugs in her system, any attorney is going to tell her, first, do not speak to anyone other than the attorney, because anything you say can be used against you. The second thing I would do immediately is get her into alcohol and or drug treatment. That is probably the most important thing. The last thing you want is for this to ever happen again. Anytime someone is in the hospital, it makes it difficult for law enforcement to proceed. And so it slows the process down. Keep in mind that Anne Heche isn't going anywhere. It's not like she can up and leave. And so the assumption is that if, in fact, she gets better, once she is, they will arrest her and bring her before a judge who will, at that time, potentially suspend her license, and then the case will move forward. Assuming the LAPD and the district attorney's office decides to go forward with the case. There's no question they're going forward with the case. It would be crazy if they didn't. Crazy. Now take into consideration the fact that Anne Heche's persona is so important to her livelihood, it becomes even more serious. Now, do I believe at the end of the day she's going to do serious jail time? I don't. I'm hopeful that if she is arrested, that she'll get the help that it seems that she needs. But can it have a permanent effect? First of all, having a criminal record, certainly, and can it have an impact on her ability to work in the profession she's worked in all her life? It certainly can.